Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you tonight. I know we got a lot of people missing for CYC and various things, sick and stuff, but I appreciate all of you that are here tonight. I'd rather walk around, but I'm doing slides, so I got to stay right with this microphone. So bear with me. I'm not used to using slides either, so hopefully I can get through this okay. What I'm going to talk about tonight is something, and this usually works out well for me because Scott and I help out with the Marble Hill congregation, and whenever Brian asked me to do a class or a sermon or something, I said, well, I'll just do something I'm talking about there because it's fresh on my mind and I can probably relate it better than doing something cold. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. We've been studying 1 Samuel at Marble Hill, and I decided to speak about David, which kind of goes along with what Brian spoke about Abraham last week. So we're kind of looking at some men of great faith, so it goes along with what he was teaching last week. Now, I only have one prop tonight, and so I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think, what first comes to your mind when you're thinking about David? Let me see if this helps. David and Goliath. You know, that's probably what everybody thinks of about David. And I'm not going to spend much time on that because I taught a class several months ago on David and Goliath, chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. So we'll talk about that briefly. But there's so much more than just David and Goliath, the story in the Old Testament. There's so much rich account of David and people associated with him. And I want to go over some of those things tonight. I will be kind of two parts. I'm going to go over some of the highlights. And again, there's no way we could cover everything about David. We'd be here for a week. But I want to cover a few of the highlights. And after that, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm just going to give you some things that have impressed me personally. They're in no special order. Some of them you're probably familiar with, some of you may not be. But they were impressive to me about the life of David, and I'd like to go over them with you. The first thing, well, obviously this is the title. This is my lesson about David. And David, you know, in spite of what we think about him, he was a great man, but he also was not a perfect man. There hasn't been a perfect man. There never will be a perfect man on the earth. The only perfect man that's been on earth is Jesus. But David was a great man, and I can relate to him in a lot of ways. And so we'll look at some of the highlights of his life tonight. First thing I want to look at in 1 Samuel 16 is when we first see David come on the scene in chapter 16. Saul, remember, Saul had been chosen as king, or the Israelites wanted a king, and God chose him. Remember, he was a head taller than anybody. He certainly looked the sort of a king. He looked like royalty, and he was God's first anointed king of Israel. But he hadn't followed the direction of God. He'd been told to do certain things, and he hadn't carried those things out. So God decided to replace him with another king. So the Lord told Samuel that he'd pick one of Jesse's sons. So Samuel thought, okay, there's several sons, and they probably walked by him in order of age. These are all probably big, strapping sons. Most of them are probably in the army of Israel, and the first one, probably the oldest one, came up to him, and he probably said, oh, this is the man. This is probably him. Nope, not him. They went through all of Jesse's sons, and Samuel asked, is there any more? And Samuel asked, and they said, David, well, he's out. He's tending the sheep. He's a shepherd. So they brought David in, and he was the chosen one. He was the one that was anointed by Samuel. So we see David anointed here, but he isn't immediately going to take over as king, and it's going to be a long process before we see him take over as the actual king of Israel. He was a shepherd, and a lot of what he did as a shepherd prepared him for being a king, prepared him for the things he was going to have to do as a leader of the army and other things as king. A lot of things that prepared him he was prepared by being a shepherd, acting as shepherd. Then we go into David in Saul's service. There was at this point, God had rejected Saul as king, and a bad spirit became on him. It tortured him every once in a while, and a good spirit came on David. So David, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself here. David played the harp to soothe Saul. When he had this bad spirit come over him, David would play the harp, and it would make Saul feel better. And eventually he also became Saul's armor bearer. So at this point, he left the fields. He wasn't a shepherd anymore. He became full-time in service of Saul. Of course, this is the one I mentioned at the beginning, which you all think of, and we think of David, is David and Goliath. I think you probably remember when I taught the class on this, I brought the yardstick with the ruler stuck on top of it so we could see how tall Goliath was. He was over 9 feet tall. He was a giant. He had armor weighed over 100 pounds. He had a spearhead that weighed 25 pounds or 15 pounds. And we talked about all those things. You've learned those from day one in classes as a kid too. But Goliath was the giant. Anyone that would face him, anyone from the Israel army of Israel or Saul himself, could face off with him, but no one did. They were all scared of him. They were all the people in the army, and Saul himself was scared of the giant Goliath. But David comes on the scene, and he's not afraid of him. He's not a warrior. He's not part of the army, but he's not afraid of Goliath, and he kills him. And I'm not going to go into more detail until later on about that. The next thing I wanted to look at is the friendship of David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel 18. Jonathan, it's an amazing account of the friendship between these two men. It says Jonathan loved David as his own self. I don't know if you have a friend like that. It's a great example for us. And he made a covenant with David. Jonathan knew that David, he had a feeling probably that David was going to be king. Jonathan was Saul's son. He was next in line. And he could have, his loyalties you would think would be with his father, but he was loyal to David as a friend, a soulmate for David. This friendship continued, but Saul became jealous for reasons that, David was very successful. He was the leader of the army, and everything he did was successful. Everything he did for Saul was very successful. And to the point where when he came back from battle, the ladies were singing about the 10,000s that David had killed and the thousands that Saul had killed. So this really ticked Saul off, and he was jealous, and he was always, as it says, he had an eye out for David from then on. He was suspicious of David. So he tried to kill David a couple of times. We see in chapter 18 to pin him to the wall with a spear, but David escaped. And then he tried to get him killed by sending him out and fighting the Philistines, which is kind of a foretelling of what David would do with Bathsheba's husband Uriah later on. So that's kind of interesting. So, but Jonathan was looking out for him, and he helped him. Again, they had the friendship between Jonathan and David. They come up with a plan to see if Saul was kind of wishy-washy on whether he was going to kill David. It seems like Jonathan kind of talked him out of it, but David was still pretty sure that Saul was out for him. So he devised this plan at the New Moon Festival, where every month there was a festival. They all came to eat, and David told Jonathan, or they agreed to tell Saul that David had been requested to go to a feast with his own family back in his hometown. So the first day of the feast, David wasn't there, and Saul noticed it, and he thought, well, maybe he's unclean, or for some reason he's not here today. Well, the second day came, and David wasn't there, and Saul blew up. And he said, why is he doing this to me? He's against me. And again, the suspicions arose in Saul, and he definitely wanted to kill David. But Jonathan, again, was helping him out and trying to keep his father from killing him. After this, David escaped the attempts at his life from Saul. He escaped to the land of the Philistines. Unfortunately, when he went there, they recognized him. They probably heard this song. They knew the exploits of David. They knew his successes against their army, and they recognized him. So he sees that, so he immediately tries to do something to knock them off the track, and he plays like he's insane. He lets the saliva go down on his cheek. He kind of slobbers on his beard, and he's scratching the wall with his fingernails like a madman. And the king of the Philistines says, "What are you doing, sending this guy? Why you got this guy around? I don't need another madman. That's not going to do me any good here." So David found another way of escape by faking insanity. It's an interesting story. Next, we have David going, after he's escaped, he goes to the priest Ahimelech to get some food and a sword. He tells Ahimelech, he's on a mission from the king, and he had to leave really quick, and he didn't have his sword, so he asked if Ahimelech could give him some food and give him a sword. So Ahimelech gave him the showbread from the tabernacle. The bread that was really supposed to be just for the priest, but he gave it to him, and he also gave him the sword of Goliath. So Saul found out about this, and he had Ahimelech and 85 priests killed. He asked his servants to do it, but they refused to do it, so he asked another person, one of his chief servants, to kill Ahimelech and all the priests. And they did that. Not only did they do that, but they killed everyone in the city of Nob, all the priest families, their young, their old, their cattle, everything. It amazes me sometimes to think about some of the treachery we see in the Old Testament, the number of people that died. And apparently this one man, in the orders of Saul, killed not only the 85 priests, but the many people living in the city also. Interestingly enough, too, and I didn't know this until I was studying it, Ahimelech was the great-grandson of Eli, the high priest. Remember Eli and his two evil sons? And God proclaimed against Eli that, his family would be cursed because of the sin of his sons, and Eli not taking care of that sin. And here we are many years later seeing part of that prophecy fulfilled when Ahimelech was killed. So it's interesting how, it always amazes me how God works, and we see that in the Old Testament, in the New Testament too. When God says he's going to do something, it may not happen immediately, but it's going to happen eventually through one way or the other. So it's an interesting thing that I hadn't known before I studied 1 Samuel. Finally, we have in chapter 23, the last meeting between David and Jonathan. And again, this whole study of looking at 1 Samuel and looking at Jonathan and David is such a wonderful story of friendship. If we could only be the kind of friend that Jonathan was to David and vice versa, we would be so much better off. And I think it's a lesson for us all to learn. Then we have David becoming king. He was king for 40 years, 7 in Hebron and then 33 in Jerusalem. Finally, I just want to hit real quickly the story we're all familiar with, David and Bathsheba, where he was out looking around and he saw Bathsheba bathing, And one thing led to another, and he had an affair with her and committed a great sin. What I've read, four of the 10 commandments were broken by David in his sin with Bathsheba. So it was a very great sin that he committed with her. Again, these are just some of just a few of the things that we look at and probably are most familiar with when we look at the life of David. But now I want to spend some time looking at some things that impressed me in the life of David. Again, there's in no special order. Some of them you may know about, some of them you may not. First, one of the admirable traits that I found or looking at David is his dependence on God, or always looking to God for guidance. In the 17th chapter, the account of David and Goliath, we see times that David mentions, I want you to pay attention to this, and I highlighted these verses so you can see what I'm talking about. The number of times that David mentions God or the Lord in these verses. Starting out in verse 26, when he's speaking of Goliath, he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So there's the first time. Goes on, when Saul told him he wasn't able to go against Goliath, you're just a small boy. This man's been training all his life, and he's a giant. He's a great soldier. You don't have a chance. But David told him, he said, "Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So you see the number of times just in this passage here that he's mentioned the Lord or God. And finally, in verses 45 through 47 of chapter 17, when Goliath threatened him, he said, then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So look at this passage. I counted 7 times in this small space of verses that David has mentioned the Lord or God or he, speaking of the Lord. So we see where the allegiance of David was. We see where the faith of God or David was. It was in the one and only God. Next, I'd like to look at something that amazed me. The number of times that David allows God to work in his life and guide the decisions that he makes. Saul had attempted, not only these 2 times I mentioned back in chapter 18, but several more times Saul has attempted himself or had tried to have other people kill David on numerous occasions. But David never took advantage of any situation that he had where he could kill Saul. We see in the cave in chapter 24, verses 4 through 7, or I'll start actually in chapter 24, verse 3. It says, "So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, 'This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you.' And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut off Saul's robe. And he said to his men, 'The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord.' So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul." So here's a perfect opportunity for David to kill his enemy, to kill Saul, who's been trying to kill him. But he doesn't do it because Saul is the Lord's anointed. Another occasion that David had a chance to get Saul was when he was sleeping in chapter 26. I'll start in verse 7. It says, "So David and Abishai came to the people by night where Saul lay sleeping within the camp, with his spear stuck in the ground by his head, and Abner and the people lay all around him. Then Abishai said to David, 'God has delivered your enemy into your hand this day. Now therefore, please, let me strike him at once with a spear, right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time.' But here's what David said to Abishai. 'Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?' David said furthermore, 'As the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed.' So David again refused to take Saul's life. He said, 'Either the Lord will strike him, or his day will come when he dies, or he'll die in battle,' which he ended up finally doing. But he refused to, despite the wonderful, easy chance he had to kill Saul, he refused to do it because Saul was the Lord's anointed. I think we can also learn a lesson from David about how to deal with sin in our lives. He was confronted by David. We spoke briefly about his sin with Bathsheba. And he was confronted by Nathan with his sin. And he said, so David said to Nathan after David had confronted him with it, "I have sinned against the Lord." He didn't make excuses. He didn't say, this is the reason I did this. He didn't come up with any excuses. He just said, "I have sinned against the Lord." What a great example of repenting or turning away from sin we have from David here. Also, later on, David ordered a census just on his own out of pride or for whatever reason. It wasn't authorized by God. So he said in chapter 24, verse 10, after God told him he's going to be punished for this, and it says, "David's heart condemned him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, 'I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now I pray, O Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I've done very foolishly.'" And it's interesting. Again, David was quick to repent, quick to admit his sin, and sometimes I think that's something we need to think about when we sin. Are we able to repent? Are we able to turn from it? Are we able to admit it to one another, the sin that we have in our lives? Even though David repented of his sin, he still had to deal with the consequences, just like we do. We can be forgiven of a sin, but we still might have to deal with things that come about as a result of that sin. As a result of his sin with Bathsheba, the son that Bathsheba conceived died, so he lost a son. As a result of that unauthorized census that David had his people do, 70,000 men lost their lives. It's just unfathomable to me. Can you imagine what David must have felt like when he found out, this is the result of my frivolous taking of a census of the army or of the people of Israel? I can't imagine. Sometimes we do the same thing. We either blame somebody else or we don't want to take responsibility for our sin, and we don't want to have to deal with the consequences. But unfortunately, our sin will find us out, and we will have to deal with the consequences. And I think that's a great example that David has given us in dealing with sin. Another thing that always impressed me about David was him always seeking God's assurance or guidance when making his decisions. You may not be familiar with this passage, but the Philistines attacked Keilah, and so David asked the Lord. He said, "Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, 'Shall I go and attack these Philistines?' And the Lord said to David, 'Go and attack the Philistines and say at Keilah.' But David's men said to him, 'Look, we're afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the enemies of the Philistines, armies of the Philistines?' Then David inquired of the Lord once again. And the Lord answered and said, Rise, go down to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. So again, a couple of times there, David isn't depending on his advisors or what he thinks should be done. He's going to the Lord and asking the Lord, should I do this? And he went to the Lord twice in this occasion. Later in the chapter, when David found out that Saul may be trying to trap him in the city or in Keilah, he went again to the Lord. He said, when David knew that Saul plotted evil against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? Or, O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men to the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver you. So he always looked to the Lord for guidance, and God gave him guidance, either through a prophet or for whatever way that God saw fit to get the word to David. And made me think about the decisions I make. I've taken some classes when I was in the Air Force about, this is how you make a decision. They go off through all these steps of, this is what you got to do to make a good decision. And I think about that, and there were some good ideas there. But how do we make decisions? Do we think we know best, or we consult an expert about it, or do we go to God? Do we think about going to God first? Sometimes that's kind of on down the list before we go to God when we're getting ready to make an important decision. So something to think about that David did that I think we should also do too. Finally, I'm a treasurer, so I had to get something about giving. You know that. Something that impressed me about David was his generosity and knowing that everything he had came from the Lord. These are some of my favorite verses. And, David wanted to build a temple for God. And it talks about in 1 Chronicles, the 22nd chapter, verses 7 and 8. It says, David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have sinned, you have shed much blood, and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed blood on the earth in my sight. So he wanted to do it, but he couldn't. God wouldn't allow him to do it because of all the blood that he'd shed as the leader of the army. So it goes on in chapter 29 of 1 Chronicles that David couldn't build the temple, but he's going to do everything he can to help his son prepare to build that temple. All the materials, all the money he needed to build the temple. And it's interesting to me, it points out that even from David's own personal fortune, he took money, a lot of money and goods, so Solomon would have everything he needed to build the temple. And not only that, his men saw the example that he set, and they did the same thing. They provided from their own money and from their own fortunes materials and money to build the temple to God. Do we think about that when we give back to God? Do we think about what God said here? It just amazes me what David says, but who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer so willingly as this? For all things come from you, and of your own we have given you. That says it all, doesn't it? What a great privilege it is for us to be able to give back, because everything we have comes from God. Everything, we think we're a hot shot. I have this great job. I've got this money through whatever means, but it all is there because God allowed it. And we need to think about that and think about how blessed we are when we give back to Him, because it all came from Him. Why did Saul fail and David succeed as the king? Saul, he didn't obey the commands he was given. He trusted himself and his advisors, his fighting men, more than he did trust in God. He wouldn't repent from his sin. He broke his vows. He broke promises. He vowed not to kill David, and he turned right around and attempted to kill him again. So we see the failures of Saul. He started out well. He was the first anointed king of Israel. He started out well. He won battles, but he couldn't keep it up. He just couldn't allow his own ego to come after God and consulting with God. On the other hand, we have David, who always, he wasn't the head above everyone else. He wasn't that tall. He wasn't that impressive of a man as Saul was, but his outward appearance wasn't what God was looking at. When he sinned, he repented. He confessed to his sin. He fessed up to his sin. He obeyed God's word, and he always did what God asked him to do. And that's why it says that he had the heart after God. In Acts, the 13th chapter, verses 7, I'm going to read verses starting in verse 17. It says, the God of this people, Israel, this is Paul speaking, he says, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. And with an uplifted arm, he brought them out of it. Now, for a time of about 40 years, he put up with their ways in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land to them by allotment. After that, he gave them judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And afterward, they asked for a king. So God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up for them David as king, to whom he also gave testimony and said, listen to this, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. What an amazing thing to say about a person. Isn't that something we should all be shooting for? To be able to, for God to call us a person after his own heart? What an amazing thing that would be. It's something we should all be striving for. David's faith was amazing. A great man. He wasn't perfect. We should all strive for the kind of faith that David had and continue our growth as Christians in our faith. So again, this is just a little bit about the life of David, some of the things that we all know about, some of the things that impressed me about his life, me personally. A great deal of the Psalms were written by David. I urge you to read the Psalms of David. Look at the little headings at the beginning of a lot of them. It'll say, for instance, he wrote this one when Doeg the Edomite was betraying him to Saul. And it's interesting to read the account in 1 Samuel and read the Psalms that go with them. So I've never done that before, so I urge you to do that. There's so much we can learn, so much we can read about David. But he wasn't perfect. He sinned, but he was willing to take responsibility for his action and confess and repent and come back to God. Are we willing to do that? Have you repented from your sin? Have you, unless you've obeyed the gospel, the blood of Christ is not going to do you any good. You have to obey the gospel in order to encounter the blood of Christ, which takes away the sin of us all. If you haven't done that, I invite you to come to do that now. If you hadn't, or if you need the prayers of the church for whatever reason, we stand ready to help you right now. Now's the best time. We ask you to come if you need to while we stand and sing. I wonder